Welcome Naoise Dolan to Deep Read. We're here at the Miu Miu Literary Club in Milan, which is in its second iteration under the direction of Mrs. Miuccia Prada. We're very happy to be here. Thank you for being in conversation with me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Miu Miu, for having us. This is really fabulous. The theme for this year's Literary Club is a woman's education. So I thought maybe we could just start by you telling me a little bit about your own education and looking back, sort of, if there were any formative teachers or even books that really proved to be pivotal for you.
Well, I remember when I was a teenager, I read for the first time Wuthering Heights, and the introduction described Emily Bronte as highly, if haphazardly educated. And I think that perfectly encapsulates the state of my education at the time, because I was very frequently absent from school, but I read voraciously enough that managed to compensate in a piecemeal kind of way. I was never an extremely dedicated student, but I did want to learn things. It just wasn't necessarily the things that might appear in an exam. And there was enough overlap between that innate thirst for knowledge and the exams themselves that I did okay. And then I went to university, studied English literature, did a master's in Victorian literature specifically, and overall I would say I remain fundamentally incompatible with any too formalized or measured form of learning, but I do enjoy finding things out for myself, really.
Yeah, I was reading some press on you, and you seem like quite an autodidact. You've taught yourself multiple languages, I believe.
Yeah.
You can speak Italian.
Yeah.
And you just wrote something in Italian.
Yeah.
What's your process like for teaching yourself languages? I'm really fascinated by anyone who's able to do that.
It depends on whether I already speak related languages. So in the case of Italian, I had the substantial head start of already having studied French and Spanish at school. And so I show up in Tuscany for a residency and I'm already understanding a great deal of what I hear. And I think when you've got that base, you can really just jump in. And as long as you're not too embarrassed or scared of making mistakes, it's quite an intuitive thing. But then studying languages where I truly don't know what's going on at all. Like, I started learning Slovak last year because I was going to be in a festival in Bratislava, and
Wow.
That one I did need to revert to the textbook quite a bit more, because I tried to listen to podcasts in Slovak thinking it worked for Italian. It did not work for Slovak.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
I mean, Slovak is on the back burner for now because I don't see any more context in which I'll be using it in the near future, but it's a wonderful language, and I feel like I will circle back to it eventually because I enjoy related languages. I enjoy seeing those subtle connections and the false friends and the slight nuances between the different Romance languages, between the different Germanic ones, between the Celtic ones, but I don't have any Slavic language to a fluent level, and I'm really taken with Slovak, so maybe that will be a journey down the line.
Fair enough. So aside from Slovak, how many languages would you say proficient in now?
Oof, proficient is a touchy word. I would say I speak 6 languages, but how I will do really depends on how often I've been using them, because you can't keep the 6 of them constantly on rotation every single day. But yeah, 6 undeniably speak well, or otherwise really depends.
6 is not bad, even if not to full proficiency. I want to come back to language. We were actually just going down a little bit of a rabbit hole around it before we started the podcast, and it really features quite prominently in your books, particularly in The Happy Couple. I felt like language just came up again and again, and also in exciting times. Before we do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the cultural education / conditioning that some of your characters are subjected to. There's a great chapter in The Happy Couple where it's sort of like a timeline of Celine's cultural and formal education, social education, where she sort of breaks down the books that she's read and how they've shaped her, key moments in her childhood, moments that happened at school, all of which culminate in her deciding to marry a man, even though she's been happily in a relationship previously with a woman. And there's this great line, the chapter ends with, "She's not an idiot, she's just been carefully taught." I just wonder if you could expand a little bit on that particular chapter and the way that you end it and what you were trying to convey with that one.
I suppose I was trying to account for the fact that we can inadvertently sound condescending when we talk about female socialization, as though women were helplessly absorbing what's around them without any kind of critical lens or any kind of reason to do so, when actually women are doing what is rational, what they are encouraged to do, what they are rewarded to do. And so I wanted to present that cultural history of the character in that context, in the context of here's a rational person who has critical capacities, who is not hitting herself in the face repeatedly for no reason, but who has absorbed precisely the messages that one would expect a person to, with good sense. It makes sense to believe those things about yourself. It makes sense to respond accordingly in most social contexts. And that's sad. It's something that, of course, we should try to change. But I think acknowledging that it often makes sense to respond as though the world were misogynistic, because it is in fact misogynistic, isn't women being stupid or naive or self-defeating. It's actually tragically quite rational.
An act of self-preservation as much as anything else, right? Can you talk to me a little bit about your own experiences sort of encountering that kind of education/conditioning growing up in Ireland, particularly sort of early experiences of sex education? What kind of narratives were you absorbing? Because, you know, the characters in your book are often queer, bisexual, and I know that you yourself have spoken about being queer yourself, and what was it, what did it take for you to be able to tackle that through your characters on the page and also in your personal life, given that you were subjected to what it seems like quite a lot of moralising in the culture you grew up in?
Yeah, well, I would say Irish sex education when I was growing up, and I wouldn't be surprised if it were still like this, was largely about risk avoidance / minimization. So it was never presented to us that sex might be something pleasurable that you undergo in order to have a good time. It was just assumed that sex is going to happen, and since it's going to happen, here's how to avoid the most calamitous consequences of it. And I was lucky because although I'm Catholic, I went to a Protestant school, and so contraception was mentioned. Many Catholics I know my age just were not told about this in a school context. We're literally told abstinence or ? And so it could have been worse. I was not fed the active propaganda that many people I know were. But I think a lot of the faults in Irish sex education at that time were more of omission than of active malice, because there were no models presented for how you might behave in a queer relationship. So you have to make it up as you go along for yourself without that kind of cultural preparation. And so compared to the Ireland of the past, there was less actively said that could be considered hateful to anyone's identity or so forth. But there was that absence of positive encouragement and examples and a sense of community, I suppose. It felt hugely isolating. And I don't think that was exclusively in a queer way. I think everyone my age was profoundly lonely because it wasn't an emotionally open context. I don't think you can be emotionally open as a country if you're not sexually open, if you don't talk about that huge aspect of the human psyche. And so I see things shifting now in Ireland. I don't know if they've shifted enough, and I don't know if they ever will.
That's really fascinating. One of the kind of more poignant aspects of Exciting Times is the passages where the protagonist sort of unpacks how the abortion ban, which was only repealed in 2018, has sort of affected the way that she navigates having sex with men. Again, not having grown up in that context, Ireland is so close, and yet in that way it feels so far that women of my own generation, my own age, have had to enter relationships with this. Or maybe you can explain it more about how it has shaped the way that women go about approaching heterosexual relationships and what you write about in the book in that way.
Yeah, it's definitely a huge pragmatic element that dictated a lot of heterosexual sex in Ireland, and not just in the narrow sense of if someone needs to suddenly come up with several €1,000, is their partner going to help them or not, but more broadly, you can't have silence without that silence spreading. And so what starts as something that is statistically unlikely to be an issue if you're using contraception, I think expanded to a general shame about sexuality that could only have impacted heterosexual relationships negatively. Now, I was never in one during that time, so I can't speak directly to the heterosexual experience of the abortion ban, but from what my straight friends have told me, it seems like even when they were with men who were passionately for repeal, even when they were with men who were knocking on doorways, begging people to vote yes, there's an emotional distance when your partner has that right in the first place, when your partner will be voting for what you can do with your body, even if they vote the right way.
One of the texts for this year's Miu Miu Literary Club is, of course, Fumiko Enchi's The Waiting Years, which is set in Meiji-era Japan, sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, which is a period of massive transition in Japan, from what I understand. Your books are set in a much more contemporary context. They feel very modern, but at the same time, it's kind of fascinating / depressing that the women are often navigating similar dilemmas. They're navigating patriarchy and sort of like the economic power dynamics that come with it. Female sexuality is a tool of empowerment, sometimes a tool of sort of submission in other contexts, and the ways that women often sort of shrink or silence ourselves in order to, as you say, sort of just get by then and now. I just wondered if you had any sort of new insights reading Enchi's work and what you made of the book in general.
I really loved the complicated vision of female solidarity because it's not automatic, it's not easy, they're human, they have moments of jealousy, of competition, and not because they're women, but because they're people in a context where there are scarce resources and where they're having to deal with volatile, abusive men. And so that complexity is fully acknowledged, but nor are they simplified to only surviving. They find moments of closeness and of understanding that are, in a startling way, really quite touching, and they're never looked down on for the choices that they make. It's always incredibly clear to us as a reader why, even if we could see alternatives, those alternatives, for whatever reason, weren't visible to those women or weren't viable. And I just find it remarkable how warmly you can feel about reading some of these quite objectively horrible things happening to them, because at the end of it, they never seem degraded or compromised by having to exist in this very patriarchal context. They always find their dignity and their closeness with each other.
She's not an idiot, she's just been carefully taught. Yeah, that's what I thought, because I read them, I was reading, your work and those books, and The Waiting Years in tandem, and again, even vastly different characters, very different concerns and lifestyles, etc. But those parallels between how they're navigating their experiences, and as you say, in your work, which is very devoid of moral judgment, you don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like the purpose of your characters who make various choices, some of which could be deemed slightly questionable choices, you're not there to judge them on the page, you just sort of lay out what it is that's happening. So would you say that that's something that you strive for, sort of a moral objectivity when it comes to characterizing?
Yeah, in as much as I can. And I think you have to accept that objectivity has its limits and that you are a person composing a text in a particular time with a particular set of influences, etc. But I'm definitely not out to teach my reader anything. And so I never know how to respond when people ask me, what's the lesson, what should I take from this? And they do, surprisingly often. I think maybe English class sets people up to approach writing that way. Or I suppose an element of it as well could be the expectations that when women write, it cannot be for any aesthetic reason. It cannot be because they find it intellectually satisfying to craft a sentence. It must be because they're trying to change and improve those around them. When actually, I barely care if people read the books, let alone if they come away from it changed. That's not to say I'm not very happy and grateful that things have gone the way that they have, but the main reason that I write is because I enjoy being good at something.
Fair enough. And there's that's a refreshing honesty. I think actually one of your characters has the same thing. She's a virtuoso pianist, and that's also, if I'm correct, that's also her kind of explanation for why she does what she does. She's not looking for validation or acclaim. She just really enjoys being good at playing the piano.
Yeah, and I think it's okay to like being good at things. I think we'd be a happier species if we were able to own our pleasure in that. And I think in a weird way, arrogance is born of not being able to validate yourself. That's what makes people need to go out there and get everyone responding rapturously to them. Whereas the people who are able to just enjoy based on their own judgment, their own proficiency at something, are often the people who don't then demand fawning from everyone around them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the main objective of therapy, right? To be able to self-validate rather than spend your whole life searching for other people to do it for you. Obviously, one of the key themes for this year's literary club is sort of sex and desire, and you write a lot about sex and desire and the dynamics of sex, particularly between sort of, the age group that your characters loosely fall in, sort of early 20s to early 30s, broadly. Would you say that's correct?
Well, there are none in their 30s yet, but
right.
one day maybe.
They're not decrepit. There's so much in the media about how, let's call young, I hate saying young people, about 20-somethings are actually not very interested in sex, not having sex, and that sort of sex and desire has fallen away as like a central impulse, which is something that I think throughout history has really guided youth, certainly. And that's really fascinating to me. Again, not true of your characters. They seem to center their desire first and foremost in their lives. Not always, but often they're driven by it, they're led by it. What do you make of the kind of the narrative that desire it no longer holds a central function in the lives of young people? And if you agree with that, what do you think it might have been replaced by?
I'm not sure if I agree. It seems to me that we've just lost a lot of social confidence and social skills, and so people don't know how to flirt anymore. And without the framework of flirting, it's very difficult to express desire, but also to experience it fully, because desire isn't entirely an inward thing. It's often through flirting with someone that you fancy them more and more, because flirting feels good as you're doing it. And so I think people, they wouldn't be talking about this as an issue if they didn't still have the desire. And so I think if you're asking why don't I desire something, that is desire for it. I think about this a lot in terms of God. The way I realized that I'm not an atheist was I was thinking so constantly, why can't I believe in God? Why can't I believe in God? But actual atheists don't care. Right. They just move on, especially in our society. Maybe a few hundred years ago, actual atheists were like, I don't believe in God, but there are social consequences to not believing in God, so how do I pretend to believe? But if you're asking yourself every day, why don't I believe in God? You do functionally believe in God because you think there's a God for you to not believe in. I think the same is true with desire. I think the amount that our society talks now about, I suppose, this lack of ability to take pleasure anymore, or in a more mundane sense, why aren't young people having more sex? Which I think the most straightforward answer in Dublin anyway is they all live with their parents. But if we're asking the question, we still do have desire. We just aren't funneling it in ways that are enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you bring up living with their parents, because in your books, like any books set in the modern day, sort of housing and the dynamics of that are quite a prominent thing, because it really does impact the way that young people live now. And maybe you could argue that sort of the insecurity and the instability around that has slightly taken the sexiness out of everyday living. You've lived in a lot of different places, from what I understand. You've lived in Hong Kong, like your protagonist in Exciting Times, Berlin. You've lived in London. I think, are you now back in Dublin?
Yeah.
How does your geographic location shape the way that you work and the way that you think?
Mostly by its impact on my happiness levels. So happiness levels were very low in London.
Tell me more.
It will shock anyone who's lived there to hear this. First time anyone has ever said this about London. Very hot take on my part. But happiness levels were low, and I can't even blame the usual factors, because I was living in a nice area. I was living in Hampstead. My flatmate and I got a very good deal because we moved in during the pandemic, and so the landlord had been planning to sell the place. Suddenly market takes a dip, and so they think I'll just rent it out as easily as I can for the next couple of years. And they have indeed since sold it. But as a result, fairly low rent, nice area, nice flatmate.
Hampstead as good as it gets, really.
Yeah. Oh, Hammersmith, sorry, not Hampstead.
Oh, I thought you said Hampstead.
No, I
You
did.
did?
I just mixed them up.
Okay,
but
Hammersmith a little more understandable.
Yeah, but so it's not that it was even a terrible London experience relative to London experiences. I'm aware that the gamut runs considerably lower than that, but it just wasn't my place.
Yeah.
And that's how it is sometimes. And I moved to Berlin and had no real conscious reason to do so, just an instinct that it might suit me better. And indeed it did. And then my writing improved. And so I had substantially written The Happy Couple before I moved to Berlin, but the last couple of edits were quite important for that book, and those occurred in Berlin, and I think it made a difference.
How about Hong Kong?
I think I was so busy there that I didn't have the time to ask if I was happy. I was doing a million things. I had contractually 50 hours of work a week. I was also secretly, illegally tutoring for another like 20, so I just didn't have time to think, and that was perfect for me at the time. Because I think we have this binary between, do you heal from trauma by just pushing through it and distraction, or do you heal from trauma by processing it and sitting with it? When I think actually for most people what works best is a back and forth. Certainly for me, I run this relay of sit with the trauma, go out and do things, and I don't plan it that way, it's just how things tend to shape up. And so I think that's what I was doing in Hong Kong, because I was 24 when I went there, so I had 24 years of trauma to push through as best I could, and I managed, and I wrote a book at the same time, so
It worked out fine.
Yeah, it was a good year.
How are you finding being back in Dublin?
Strange, because, and this is something that people from this city will identify with, I don't know any Dubliners anymore, and I don't know where they've gone. I do know where they've gone to Glasgow, all the Dubliners are going to Glasgow, but...
Why is that?
Rent.
Yeah.
They're like, we need a city with Celtic vibes where I'm not paying 2k a month for a studio apartment, and
Not in England, crucially.
That is an important factor.
Yeah.
But yeah, I am enjoying it. I have never been in walking distance of town before, and so the apartment they've given me for the residency, that's changed things quite a bit. If you rely on Dublin bus every day, your life will not be the best of lives. So I think I'm in a better place due to the absence of Dublin bus from my daily routine.
Are you finding it creatively fruitful?
Yes, so I'm finishing up edits on my third novel. I'm doing quite a bit of journalism and then a few other bits and bobs too. So yeah, on the go.
You're in a residency, and I was doing some press research on you, and I couldn't quite understand the dynamics of where you were living. It was like you've been given a residency in sort of new development that's in the centre of town. Yeah. Good. I'm glad. That's exactly what should be happening with new developments in overpriced cities.
Yeah.
In another interview I found, you said that your first two books have led people to believe that, well, led people to overestimate how interested you are in the millennial generation. I think the content of your work inevitably has led you being placed in the context of also Irish writers who are very articulate about, the precise ennui and confusion of navigating youth in this moment. But I found it funny to hear you read that you actually find that a little bit of a tedious read on your own work.
Because I never wanted to write about millennials. I wanted to write about young people because I was young, and I thought if I had some burning desire to tell the story of someone who was older, I might bother to do all the research and all the introspection and all the extra effort. But if you don't feel specifically drawn to writing about someone who's got vastly more experience than you in certain ways, you're going to default to writing about young people, and people have always done that. Martin Amis did it. Why is it any different people doing it now?
Yeah.
And so I think it's that it was mostly people much older than me writing about my work, or it was Brits and Americans my own age who wanted to believe that speaking English gives them ultimate cultural access to Ireland. And millennial is a really convenient way to do that, because it completely whitewashes, for instance, that we never had a boomer generation. And you can't have millennials, as Americans and Brits define it, without having boomers, because the whole generational story is based on that clash with the generation that had it all, whereas our parents legitimately had it harder than us, much harder.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's an insight that a lot of people wouldn't think about, wouldn't consider, because the contrast between millennials and boomers is still forms so much the modern conversation. It is a little tedious at points.
Yeah.
So if not in that direction, which direction does your interest currently lie?
I'm a lot more interested in the passing of time now. So the new novel starts in the 1950s and goes up to the present day. And that forces you to think about all sorts of things. How do you compress it? How do you speed it up in parts? How do you insert all these cultural references so that people will intuitively know where we are now in the timeline? And that's been a fun challenge.
That sounds really interesting. Can we speak a little bit about the books that you've selected? They relate to this year's Literary Club themes: girlhood, sex education, and education in and of itself, of course. We're going to do them in chronological order. So can we start by talking about a classic, Sense and Sensibility, which is, of course, by Jane Austen?
Yeah, so I chose this, first of all, because I'm fascinated by the link between education and class in the text. And also the more informal, emotional education that both sisters undergo throughout. I say both because I, like everyone else, just erase Margaret, the child, because Austen is so uninterested in her. And it's my favourite thing about Jane Austen, that she truly does not care about children and makes no apology for it whatsoever. They are occasional inconveniences or funnels for the comedic foibles of the parents. But yeah, by and large, she just doesn't see them as people. And I think it's great. So the world would be tedious and sad if no one saw children as people. I don't hate children, but I think for a woman of that time to be so openly indifferent to children, I think that's great. But the two sisters' education. So it's things like the moment when Lucy Steele is truly untenable for Edward Ferrars is when he sees how badly she writes letters to him. And so women's literary expression being so closely linked to their character, not alone to their social standing, but to how much is deeply inside them. I think it's a much more complicated view of Austenian femininity than has made it into the popular culture now, where we talk about it as all just manners and dresses, when really the women's minds are being scrutinized by everyone in the text throughout. Everyone's constantly talking about what kind of thinkers they are and how they exist in dialogue with each other. And I suppose as well, I enjoy the complexity of the relationship between the sisters, because Austen doesn't typically do sisters all that deeply. She does them very funnily in the other ones, and even quite warmly. You know, Jane and Lizzie, it's a warm sistership there, sisterhood rather, but it's not got the depth of Eleanor and Marianne's.
Your second book is Memories of a Catholic Girlhood by Mary McCarthy. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
So, from a female education standpoint, I think this one touches on this cultural moment in the US where Irish Catholics had entered into whiteness more or less, more so than Italians at the time, say in the 1920s, but always at this remove. And so the account of her going to the convent school and the hierarchies existing within that place as an enclosed bubble where the Irish Catholics saw themselves as these chosen people almost, but in a context of Irish Catholicness in general not being an especially valued thing in America at that time. And I love too the portrait of Mary's own expanding mind, and how, for instance, there's a chapter where she puts on a crisis of faith in order to get attention and admiration from her peers, but then the priest can't answer her questions properly, and she starts to sincerely doubt her belief in God.
Right.
And so seeing that turn from the bossy contrarian to someone who genuinely wants answers and truth, I think the word self-awareness doesn't do it credit in its execution, because we're all self-aware one way or another, we cannot but be, but are you able to transform that into something that's useful to other people? That's the question. And she depicts that moment and that change in a way where it's not too forced, it's not too spelled out, but what emerges is a portrait of how she began to take herself seriously as a thinker.
Is there any aspects of that text that you found relatable, or sort of chimed with your own sort of growing, developing self-awareness?
Definitely how she developed her interests. She becomes a passionate Latin scholar for a time as a teenager, for example, at the start because she has a slightly contrarian impulse to like a teacher that no one else likes who teaches Latin. And that is exactly the sort of thing I got up to all the time. I developed all these sort of curiosities that didn't have much at their base, but then you develop your base through exploring the curiosity. And I think that's still largely true of me. For instance, whenever people ask, how do you get your ideas? How did this book start? I can never say anything decent because it is always just, well, something popped into my head and I proceeded. And so I think there is a certain kind of person who takes things seriously but doesn't necessarily take choice itself seriously. That my impression of my life is just that things keep coming at me and I deal with and arrange as needed. But I think I am nonetheless in other ways quite a serious person. I definitely go quite hard on a lot of things, and so seeing someone else holding that tension was quite interesting.
Yeah, sounds like it. And then finally, Assembly by Natasha Brown.
Yeah, so I think we truly need this to complete this trio of female education-centered books because Natasha Brown really questions what it means to, as a Black woman, enter existing structures, do everything you're supposed to do, tick all the boxes. And not only that, but excel, be exceptional among your peers, and still end up despising yourself and the whole thing. And so the bitterness throughout, it's not a miserable text. Her joy in linguistic play and her humor prevent it from being that, but I think it strips away the innocence of white femininity because an intrinsic part of this character's education is not only the formal element that she's succeeded academically, that she's now got a high-flying finance job, but that she has to be aware of interacting with these white majority spaces in a way that those who benefit from them do not need to be. And that hyper-awareness then isn't something that I think the character can quite limit to that. She's hyper-physically aware. There's this line I will remember until my dying day where she sees underneath her white boyfriend's skin to see the food passing from his mouth down the relevant pipes. It's so grotesque and I think captures that you can't limit your hyper-alertness to one specific sphere, that if someone has to be on guard, they can't let that guard down in any way. And so it's all-encompassing, it's overwhelming, and it's just a brilliant book.
Yeah, super specific personal experience, but as you say, one where anyone could relate to that sense of a newfound consciousness. When you encounter a person or have a moment of revelation or read a book, it often is a book, you can't go back to the way things were before. Everything is now tinged with this new, through this new light, which I think is a very universal experience. Thank you, Nisha,
Thank you.
for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you to everyone here. Thank you to Miu Miu for putting on this amazing event. I really look forward to your panel conversation later. And thank you so much for coming.